Um, I want to welcome everybody to this second installment in YIVO's series, The Origins and Ideology of Hamas, which is a three-part series curated by Professor Jeffrey Herf, who is one of the speakers today. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director and CEO of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. This series explores some of the deep historical causes and consequences of October 7th, 2023, the explosion of Hamas violence against Israel, by going backward into both the history of Hamas and the history of Israel. Our first program, now available on the YIVO YouTube channel, explored the ideological background and etiology of Islamist anti-Semitism. Today's program will explore the integrally entwined subjects of colonialism and racism in the founding of Israel. Before turning the program over to our speakers, though, I would like to say a few words about why the YIVO Institute has taken upon itself to examine this conflict in the way that we have, a conflict that seems so far away from the traditional interest of YIVO in Eastern Europe and Russia. First, there is a direct linkage between Islamism and Nazi propaganda during the 1930s, a link still evident today in the discovery, for instance, of the Arabic language translation of Mein Kampf in a Gaza kindergarten. But such direct and indirect linkages to the European past are secondary to the larger global reality of a renewal of vicious anti-Semitism faced by Jews around the world at levels not seen since the 1920s and 30s. The founder of YIVO, Max Weinreich, wrote that the function of YIVO in America after the Holocaust was to understand the position of the Jew in the modern world. There has never in my lifetime been such a need for such an understanding. The question has been raised, why are there no Palestinians participating in this series? The reason is simply that whereas it is claimed, even most recently by Peter Beinart in the New York Times, that Palestinian voices have been routinely excluded from the public discourse on the subject of Israel-Palestinian relations. In fact, today, it is the voices of scholars, such as those participating in this series, that have been marginalized or ignored by mainstream American and often left-wing media. The result on college and university campuses is that a historical narrative has developed, often out of aspiration and political agenda, rather than historical fact. This series is designed to restore a base of historical fact to that discussion. Our speakers today are Jeffrey Herf and Benny Morris. Jeffrey has published extensively on Germany during the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and on West and East Germany during the Cold War. His books include Propaganda for the Arab World and Israel's Moment, and most recently, The Three Faces of Anti-Semitism. Benny Morris, a historian, was formerly a professor of history in the Middle East Studies Department of Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He is the author of 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War, and most recently, with Dror Zevi, The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's destruction of its Christian minorities, 1894 to 1924. This is a copy of Israel's Moment by Jeffrey Herf. This is 1948 in paperback edition from Yale University Press of Benny Morris's 1948. I urge everyone to get these two books, read them, and actually learn much about the historical background of the state of Israel. Before turning to our panelists, though, I do want to mention that the next installment of this series is going to take place on April 16th at 1 p.m. It will be a panel discussion and will concern itself with responses to October the 7th. Jeffrey Herf will lead the panel, which will include Meyer Litvak, Norman Goda, Karen Stegner, and David Hirsch. Please do not miss it. It will be most interesting. And the other program that I want to bring to people's attention that is related to this whole subject of anti-Semitism, Arab anti-Semitism, and traditional anti-Semitism is a in-person lecture on the subject of the protocols of the elders of Zion in court, the Berne trial, 1933 to 1935, and the Anti-Semitic International. It will take place on Wednesday, April 10th, 7 o'clock at YIVO. Michael Hagemeister is going to give the lecture on this subject. It will be most fascinating. So without more ado, I want to turn to Benny Morris for his introductory comments. Benny?
Thank you. The 1948 war was the most important of Israel's wars. There have been 6 or 7 with the Arab world. This was certainly the most historically significant. It changed the geopolitics of the Middle East, injecting a Jewish state into the middle of the Middle East, in fact, cutting the Arab world and the Muslim worlds in two, something which the Arab world and the Muslim worlds have never forgiven Israel for doing. It also created, and this maybe wasn't as apparent in 48 as it is today, but created a problem which is very important to this day, and that is the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, which was the chief expression, if you like, of the collapse of Palestinian society in the course of the 1948 war. These two facts, Israel's coming into existence and the Palestinian refugee problem, have turned that war into the most important, I would say, of Israel's wars. The war was a result, the end result of 70 or so years of conflict between incoming Zionist immigrants to Palestine and the native population of Palestine, of Arabs, who growingly became politically conscious and growingly resented the influx of the Jews there, albeit the Jews came because they were being oppressed in Eastern Europe and subsequently in Central Europe. But this was of no interest to the Palestinians, who feared this Jewish influx would result possibly even in their own dispossession. This was their sense. But the immediate trigger of the war, and the two peoples, the Palestinian Arabs, who gradually became a sort of an independent, separate national movement among the different Arab peoples, and the Zionist movement, which was the nationalist movement of the Jews, these two national movements clashed, as I say, for 70 years, and the war erupted. The war erupted as the immediate consequence of a United Nations General Assembly partition resolution passed on the 29th of November, 1947, in which the international community overwhelmingly supported the partition of Palestine into two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. The Arabs rejected it. The Arabs of Palestine rejected the resolution, and the Jews rejected it, accepted it, and the Arabs of Palestine immediately started hostilities. And these hostilities snowballed into the 1948 war, the first war between Israel and the Arabs. The war actually divided into two parts, and not everybody understands this, and often propagandists are mistaken on this point, but there were two parts to the war. There was a civil war between the Palestinian Arab population and the Palestinian Jewish population, a civil war between the two populations inhabiting Palestine, which was at the time under British rule until May 1948. This war began on the day after the UN partition resolution on the 30th of November 1947 with an attack by Arab terrorists or gunmen against two Jewish buses not far from Tel Aviv. And gradually this attack snowballed into full-scale civil war, which ended in May 1948 with the collapse of Palestinian society and the defeat of the Palestinian Arab militias. Israel declared statehood on the 14th of May 1948, and the following day the armies of the Arab states, the surrounding Arab states, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq, invaded the country, 15th of May, and began the second stage of the 48 war, which was a conventional war between these four states and the state of Israel, which had just come into being. And the Arab states were defeated by January 1949, and this defeat was followed by armistice negotiations between Israel and each of the Arab states, formally ending the war in 1949. There is controversy about the nature of the 48 war. The conventional wisdom, which is also correct, is that it was a war between two national movements, the Arab-Palestinian national movement, or the general Arab national movement, and the Jewish national movement, which became Israel on the 14th of May 1948. And this is true. It was a war between two political movements over territory, each aspiring, at least at the start of the conflict, for the whole of the territory. In other words, Zionism wanted all of Palestine from the river to the sea as a Jewish state. The Palestinian Arabs, from when they began their national movement in the 1920s, wanted all of Palestine from the river to the sea, and these two peoples clashed. In 1937, the British Peel Commission came to investigate and saw that the British mandate over Palestine could not continue, and it was the first international body, which proposed a two-state solution, which remains, incidentally, the basis of all right-thinking people for a solution to the conflict to this day. A two-state solution, partition of Palestine into two states. The Arabs again rejected in 1937 and continued in a rebellion which they had launched against the British. The Jews accepted the principle of a two-state solution, thus in 1937 already giving up the vision of all of Palestine for the Zionist movement, for the Jews. They accepted partition, and again were to accept partition, as I said, in 1947 when it was proposed by the United Nations. The conventional view of the war, as I say, there's a large basis to it. It's correct. There was a struggle between two national movements over the territory of Palestine, but it also had another aspect to it, which has been sort of disregarded by many historians, and that is the religious cultural nature of the war. From the Arab side, the war was a religious holy war, a jihad. From the Jewish side, it wasn't. The Zionist movement was basically anti-religious. It had a very small, insignificant religious component, but 90 or 95% of the Jews in Palestine in 1948 were secular Jews. They didn't look at the war as a religious war, but the Arabs did. On the 1st of December 1947, 2 days after the partition resolution was passed in the United Nations, the ulama of Al-Azhar, which is the most important body interpreting Islam, and if you like, the will of Allah in Sunni Islam, which is the majority of Muslims, on the 1st of December 47, they issued a fatwa, this ulama, the group of theologians from Al-Azhar University, proclaiming worldwide jihad. The Muslims of the world must unite and mobilize to fight the Jews in Palestine. The infidel was threatening to take all or part of Palestine for the Jews. And this call, this fatwa for jihad, was reissued by Al-Azhar, the ulama of Al-Azhar, again in April 47, just before the pan-Arab invasion of Palestine, and was even reissued in December 48, by which time the Arabs had lost the war, in effect. In other words, issuing this call for jihad in December 48 meant, well, we may have lost this war, but we will have a second and third round down the road, and Arabs, Muslims must mobilize for it. Another major question about the war, both of which parts, of course, Israel won, so that Israel survived the pan-Arab attack, as well as the previous assault by the Palestinian militias, relates to the war aims of the various sides in the war. And here we have a problem. Historians have a problem. Students have a problem. Israel's archives are basically open. There are restrictions. There is some censorship, but basically we have the archives, a lot of archives, Israeli archives, as well as British and American and United Nations archives, which tell us things. But the Arab archives are closed, all of them, all the Arab states at the time and since, in fact, are dictatorships, and they do not open their archives to scholars or researchers, Israeli, Arab, or foreign. So we don't know as well, as deeply, what the Arab thinking was of the different Arab states which participated in the war. And of course, the Palestinians themselves, we don't know too much about in terms of archives, because they didn't keep archives. They weren't a government in 1947, 48, and they didn't produce state papers. So there's very, very little Palestinian material from 48. There are things written over the decades since then by Palestinians about the war, but it's not actual archives from 1947, 48, telling us what Palestinian war aims were. The Israeli war aims, as I say, are much clearer because of the archives are available. And Israel, basically, the Zionist movement, entered the civil war half of the 48 war with one major aim, and that was survival, to survive the onslaught of the Palestinian Arab militias and to establish the state as the United Nations had charted out in its partition resolution. This was the primary Jewish goal in the civil war half of the 48 war. A second goal accrued to that first aim, I would say from March, April 48, and that was to expand the territory of the Jewish state emerging now beyond the borders of what the United Nations had written down in the partition resolution. And in fact, the war ended with the Zionist state, or Israel, emerging with 8,000 square miles of Palestine's 10,000 square miles, 2,000 square miles more than what the United Nations had allocated in the partition resolution. They had allocated 6,000 square miles. The war, which ended in Israeli victory, added 2,000 square miles to Jewish territory in the state of Israel, which emerged in 1949 from the war. A third war aim, and this is, I believe, was a war aim, but there are historians who disagree with this, was to reduce the number of Palestinians remaining inside the Jewish state, Palestinian Arabs. These Arabs had gone to war against the Jewish state, could be considered disloyal citizens if they remained in the Jewish state. And the aim of people like Ben-Gurion, even though it never became formal official policy, the aim of leaders like Ben-Gurion and some of the generals in the Haganah and the Israeli army, the Israeli military organizations, furthered this aim by expelling and certainly by deciding against the return of the Palestinian refugees to their homes and lands at the end of the war. There was no policy of expulsion. Some Palestinians were expelled, most simply fled from battle, but there was an Israeli government decision implemented by the Israeli army not to allow a mass refugee return, and this has been the consistent policy of Israeli governments since 1948, not to allow a mass refugee return, because such a mass return would undermine the Jewish nature of the state. It would lead essentially to an Arab majority in the Jewish state, which would mean it would no longer be a Jewish state. It would become an Arab state, maybe with a Jewish minority. These were the Zionist war aims in the Civil War. These war aims essentially remained for the Zionists the war aims of the conventional wars as well, to survive the pan-Arab onslaught, to overcome the Arab armies, and to expand the territory of the Jewish state, and preferably with as few Arabs in the state as possible. one should remember, incidentally, that about 20% of Israel's population by the end of the war was Arab. In other words, there was no policy of expulsion in any formal or general sense, and therefore 20% of Israel's population at the end of the war remained Arab. They were given Israeli citizenship, and that is why 21% of Israel's Arab population today, 21% is Arab, as opposed to about 77% Jewish. The war aims of the Arab states are not that clear. Again, as I say, because we do not have their archives, we can know. We should note what the Arab armies did when they crossed the border into Palestine, and from that one can deduce to a certain extent what their war aims were. There were also public declarations. There were also statements by Arab leaders to American and British diplomats in Amman, in Damascus, in Cairo. So from these, we can sort of understand what was the thinking of the Arab states when they invaded Palestine on the 15th of May. Israel traditionally believed and said almost from the beginning that the Arab war aim, the pan-Arab war aim, was to destroy the Zionist entity in Palestine, to destroy the emergent Jewish state. It's quite possible that was the overarching aim of the Arab armies and leaders when they invaded Palestine, but we don't have a confirmation of this in the documentation. In their public statements, the Arab leaders said, "We are invading Palestine to save our Palestinian brothers, not to destroy the Jewish state," though occasionally they did refer to destroying the Zionism or the Zionist entity, but never explicitly, "We are invading the Zionist, we're invading Israel to destroy Israel." They never said this publicly. What they certainly, we do know, was that each of the Arab states had particularist interests in the invasion. Jordan was interested in taking over the West Bank. In other words, most of the area which is today the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This was what King Abdullah of Jordan wanted when he invaded. He didn't actually attack the Jewish state, and he didn't want to destroy the Jewish state. Abdullah was unusual in this sense. He was much friendlier to the Jews than to the Palestinians. He disliked the Palestinians and disliked their leaders, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and he was willing to live side by side with the Jewish state, but he wanted to annex the West Bank, which is exactly what he did during 48 and after 48 in the course of the war. The Egyptians probably didn't want to enter the war at all, but were driven by public opinion in Egypt. The king of Egypt, Farouk, he was an illegitimate ruler, a monarch, not elected, and so on. He had incited the people, he and his government had incited the population of Egypt over the years against Zionism. And come the beginning of the war, the civil war, the public came out into the streets and demanded that the government support the Palestinians and invade Palestine. And this is what the Egyptian army did on the 15th of May. It's probable that Farouk also aimed to annex the Negev, the southern part of the state of Israel, of Palestine. That probably was also one of his war aims. Syria apparently was interested in annexing the Sea of Galilee. All of them, I think, except for the Jordanians, were interested in delivering a severe blow to Israel, if not to conquer all of Israel, at least to deliver a serious blow to Israel. But as I say, in part, they were driven by public opinion, not so much by clear political thinking. The war created three refugee problems. And one is obviously aware, everyone is aware of the Palestinian refugee problem. 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted from their homes in the course of the war. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren are recognized today as Palestinian refugees. It's very unusual in the world that down the generations, people are continuously recognized as refugees, but this uniquely has been the case with the Palestinians. And now there are some 6 million Palestinian refugees. And one of the principal tenets of the Palestinian ideology is a return of the refugees to Palestine, Israel, meaning 6 million Palestinians. Were they to enter Israel, were they allowed to come through what the Palestinians call a right of return, this would, of course, radically change the demography. Israelis would no longer continue to exist. So that's the the Palestinian refugee problem, which is still with us. The war created two other refugee problems which have vanished. Therefore, we don't know them as refugee problems today. One was that 70,000 of Palestine's 650,000 Jews in 1948, that was the number of Jews in Palestine at the time, 650,000, 70,000 of them were uprooted in the course of the war from their homes, ended up living for months in public buildings and schools and so on. But eventually, most of them, almost all of them, returned to their homes after Israel won the war, reconquered the villages which had fallen or been abandoned and whatever. And that 70,000, a problem of 70,000 internal Israeli refugees no longer existed after 49. This is not a small number, incidentally. 70,000 out of 650,000 is over 10% of Palestine's Jews were displaced from their homes. If in America there was a 10% displacement as a result of war, you would have 35 million refugees. So it's quite a lot of refugees for the small Jewish community which existed at Israel's beginnings. The third refugee problem was that of the Arab Jews, that is the Jewish communities who had lived in the Arab states over hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. In Iraq, there was a community which was at least 2,500 years old. All these communities, Iraq's Jews, Syria's Jews, Egypt's Jews, Morocco's Jews, Algeria's Jews, Yemen's Jews, all of these Jews after the 48 war, already beginning during the 48 war, were displaced from their homes. Most of them ended up immigrating to Israel and became Israeli citizens. And a minority, the better off ones, usually ended up going to France or Britain. And this refugee problem no longer exists to this day either. But the war did create three refugee problems. We're talking in terms of the Arab Jewish communities. We're talking about somewhere like 800,000 people. So that was a giant refugee problem in the 50s and 60s. But as I say, it vanished because they were properly absorbed and became citizens of Israel and some other countries as well. One last point I want to talk to very briefly, and that is the problem of, or the issue of the balance of forces in the 48 war. Most wars are won by the stronger side. When you look at a map of the Middle East, North Africa in 1947-48, of course, the Arab world was very large. It's demographically, it was overwhelming in terms of the 650,000 Jews who lived in Israel, Palestine at the time. They had tens of millions of people. The Palestinians outnumbered the Jews in Palestine by 2 to 1. Nonetheless, the Jews won. And they won partly because of stronger motivation. The war occurred 3 years after the 1940s Holocaust. The Jews feared that the Arabs were going to create a second Holocaust if they won the war in Palestine, Israel, and this gave the Jews superior motivation. Arab soldiers who came from Iraq or from the Nile Valley weren't fighting for their homes, for their own people. They were invading a foreign country. The Jews were fighting for their very lives, for their families and their homes. That was one component of Jewish strength. Another was American Jewry. American Jewry provided Israel with over $100 million, maybe $150 million in the course of the war, which sustained the Jewish economy in the course of the war and sustained the war making of the Jewish state, which enabled it to win. There were also, Israel had an advantage in having some trained manpower. Over 28,000 of Palestine's Jews had joined the British Army in World War II and acquired military skills, and this served them well in the 48 war. The Arab armies, none of them had actually fought in the war. The Jordanians had a small part in the war, but all the other Arab armies didn't, so they had no experience of making war. And the victory of the Israelis in the civil war against the Palestinians was a great benefit also in the second part of the war, when they had to fend off and eventually defeat the Arab armies. Lastly, I would say that the Jews organized for war, because the Jews felt through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, when occasionally they were assailed by the Palestinian Arabs, by mobs and militias, they felt that they would be attacked and that they must prepare for eventual massive attack by the Arabs. And so they prepared, each kibbutz had perimeter fences and perimeter lighting and bunkers and trenches and an armory. The Arabs did not prepare themselves, the Palestinian Arabs, for war. Neither did the Arab states, in fact, prepare for war. They never thought they would end up fighting a war. And the Jews organized properly for war, at least sufficiently to win that war. I'll leave it at that. That's my 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Benny. There are numerous comments and questions, but we'll try to get to those at the end of the program. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Benny. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to try and keep my remarks to just 10 minutes because I am sure there are many questions that will be directed to what Benny Morris has just said. My comments are about the way that the Arab-Israeli War and the establishment of the State of Israel was viewed in New York and Washington and Moscow and London. It's about political language and the meaning of famous words, colonialism, racism, and fascism. And the brief conclusion is that for the political left and for political liberals in the United States, in Europe, and for the communists in the Soviet bloc, the Zionist project, the establishment of the State of Israel, was viewed at the time as a leftist and anti-colonial, anti-racist, and also anti-fascist project. I'm going to share the screen here so I can accompany my comments with some images. In April of 1945, a man named Hashim al-Husseini was arrested by the British Army in Germany, by the French Army in Germany, and he was in custody in France for the following year. And in New York, you're looking at a newspaper, a photo and article about a demonstration in Madison Square Garden on June 12th of 1946. And one of the slogans at the rally is "Escape for the Nazi Mufti, but no rescue for Nazi victims." Hashim al-Husseini in those years was world famous or infamous for his collaboration with the Nazi regime. And in New York and in Washington, American liberals urged the United States and Britain and France to bring him to trial in Nuremberg or some other post-war war crimes trial, to bring his collaboration to put it to the test at a trial. They failed in that effort. But in so doing, American liberals such as Frida Kirchway, I.F. Stone, Emanuel Seller, and Robert Wagner, some of those names may be familiar to you, associated, they connected the leadership of the Palestine Arabs to collaboration with the Nazi regime. In the United Nations, in May of 1947, a special session on Palestine was held, and at that session, most famously, the Soviet UN representative, then younger Andrei Gromyko, surprised the United Nations by declaring that the Soviet Union would support a partition plan to create a Jewish state in Palestine and an Arab state in Palestine. The photo you're looking at shows Andrei Gromyko on the left and a man named Fedorkevich. Oh goodness, what is the first name is Fedorkevich, escapes me just at the moment. Alfred Fedorkevich, who is the Polish representative to the United Nations and also the vice president of the General Assembly. And Fedorkevich stunned his listeners, not only when he supported the partition plan, but revealed that he was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And he told the United Nations, "I was there myself and I saw 1.5 to 2 million burned in crematoria." And so in his view, and it was also a 2/3 majority at the United Nations, in his view, the establishment of the Jewish state was a continuation of the anti-fascist passions of the Second World War. And so he viewed Zionism, as did Gromyko, as did I.F. Stone and Frida Kirchwey and Emanuel Seller and Robert Wagner, as an anti-racist project. The Palestine Arabs were well represented at the United Nations, and the leader of the Arab Higher Committee at the United Nations was a cousin of Haj Amin named Jamal Husseini. And I don't have time to go into the details of his very long speech, but in view of the fact that the phrase Zionism as a form of racism has become part of world politics, and also now has a place, I suppose, somewhere in the academy, it's important to remember that Jamal Husseini described the Arab world, in his words, as a racial homogeneity, and he opposed the establishment of a Jewish state in British Mandate Palestine for disrupting and creating a, in modern terms, diverse and multi-ethnic world in the Arab world. He viewed multi-ethnicity as a formula for war and disruption. This dimension of racist arguments among the leaders of the Palestine Arabs in those years has not received the attention that it deserves. The argument about colonialism misinterprets the role, fundamentally misinterprets the role of the United States and Britain. And the you're looking at a photo of Secretary of State George Marshall and British Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin. In the spring of 47, as the United States began to articulate the containment of communism in what became known as the Cold War, the bond between the British and the American governments, the foreign offices, the Pentagon, the military officials, had been forged in the fire of World War II, and it was very, very close. And as Secretary of State Marshall said in the fall of 1947, the cornerstone of American foreign policy in the Middle East in the early days of the Cold War was, quote, to sustain the British position in the Middle East. And sustaining the British position in the Middle East was incompatible with the establishment of the Jewish state. And this principle, sustaining the cornerstone principle, articulated first in the spring of 47, persisted through the War of 1948. And it was also a policy that led to American and British resolutions in the United Nations preventing the entry of both military-age men, but also weapons to the young state of Israel, or the Jews. Now, in the fall of 1947, in the State Department, and I'm now drawing on the files of the United States, the archives of the United States government, the argument began to develop that the establishment of the Jewish state would damage American national security interests. This was a view of these gentlemen who were American diplomats in the Middle East: George Wadsworth, Loy Henderson, the director of the State Department's Office of Middle East and African American Affairs, Colonel William Eddy, Minister of Saudi Arabia, and then a consultant with the American Arab Oil Corporation, Aramco. These are the famous Arabists in the State Department who argued that it would be a disaster for the United States to support the establishment of a Jewish state. And if the support for the Zionist project had remained with these gentlemen alone, it would not have been such a major deal. But another gentleman, the Secretary of State himself, George Marshall, that's a photo of Marshall giving during the graduation ceremonies at Harvard in 1947, when he delivered the famous Marshall Plan speech. There is on your left, Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett, and most importantly, the new director of the planning staff in the State Department, perhaps the most famous American diplomat of the 20th century, George F. Kennan. And George Kennan was appointed to be director of the policy planning staff by Secretary of State Marshall, partly on the basis of the fame that Kennan had acquired in writing a famous set of memos about the need to contain the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War. By January 48, Kennan wrote, report of the policy planning staff on the position of the United States with respect to Palestine. It is a typically brilliant and eloquent memo for which Kennan became famous, and it argues that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine would be a disaster for the national security interests of the United States for two fundamental reasons. First, in the State Department and the Pentagon and in the Central Intelligence Agency, the view was widespread that Zionists had a certain affinity for communism and friendship with the Soviet Union, and that the establishment of the Soviet Union, the establishment of the State of Israel would thus benefit the Soviet Union in the early days of the Cold War. And second, because it would infuriate the Arab states might engage in an oil embargo at the very moment when Western Europe needed oil to assist in the economic recovery foreseen in the Marshall Plan. So the notion that the State of Israel was the product of Western imperialism or colonialism simply is false. The president of the United States, Harry Truman, did not support the establishment of the State of Israel out of colonialist reasons. He had the Holocaust very much on his mind, and he was convinced by his lawyer, Clark Clifford, that a Jewish state would not be a Trojan horse for Soviet influence in the Middle East. Those are the two fundamental points I want to make about the about the opposition to the establishment of the State of Israel in the British Foreign Office and in the foreign policy establishment of the United States, and in the enthusiasm for the establishment of the State of Israel on the part of liberals and leftists in Western Europe, the United States, and then on the part of the communists. In view of the invasion of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's lies about Ukraine, about the need to denazify Ukraine, I wanted to draw attention to one final photo, and then I'll conclude. This is a photo of the United Nations Security Council in session in January of 1948. And the gentleman on the left is Vasyl Tarasenko. On the center left is Andrew Gromyko. The center right is Noel Baker, speaking for Britain. And on the right is Warren Austin, for the American ambassador to the United Nations. And from January through August of 48, these gentlemen debated various resolutions about the civil war that Benny just described, and then the war after the invasion of May 15th. And the purpose of the American and British resolutions consistently was to push back Israeli military gains. The Tarasenko, speaking for the Ukrainian SSR, was in opposition. And he described on May of 28th of 48 that the purpose of Britain's draft resolution was designed to stifle the State of Israel. And I don't have time to go into the details of why it would stifle it, but it was biased against Israel. And what became apparent when one reads the fascinating minutes of the United Nations Security Council is that time and time again, the arguments being made by Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Avi Iban, and the new foreign minister, Moshe Sharett, were overlapping with those of Vasyl Tarasenko and Andrew Gromyko. And so the American and the British diplomats and foreign policymakers in London and Washington noted the connection and the association between the arguments being made by the leaders of the Soviet bloc and by those of Israel. And in their view, it reinforced this view that the new State of Israel would be a threat to the policy of containment of communism. There is much in the 500 pages of Israel's moment that people don't know about the international politics surrounding the establishment of the State of Israel from 1945 to 1949, And I hope people read the book, because there is a great deal in it that is new and fresh from the archives. But one last anecdote. There's a certain romance that surrounds the United States with Israel, and as Benny pointed out, the American Jews did a great deal. But what the Jews needed most of all in spring and summer of 1948, especially in view of the Arab invasion, were weapons. And they did not come from the United States or Britain. They came from communist, even Stalinist Czechoslovakia. And in a very striking conversation in May of '49 with the American ambassador to Israel, David Ben-Gurion told him that if the Jews had depended on the United States in 1948, they, quote, would have been exterminated. So we historians try to restore past realities and to remind readers today how these events were seen at the time. And at the time, if you were opposed to colonialism, if you were opposed to racism, if you were still inflamed or infused with the passions of anti-fascism from the Second World War, you would have been a staunch Zionist. And I think that that's enough. I wanted to leave more time for questions, especially for Professor Morris. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very, very much. I would like to start, Benny, if I may, with a question to you. In your book in 1948, in the last chapter of it, you write expulsionist thinking, Arab expulsionist thinking, and where it became possible, behavior characterized the mainstream of the Palestinian national movement since its inception. Does it continue to this present day, in your view? Is there any chance that new Palestinian leadership in the foreseeable future will reject this idea and make it possible for there to be a real peace? I'm not sure that Jews in the United States even necessarily realize that there has never actually been a peace between the Palestinians and the Jewish state. So I just wonder if you could speak about that for a second.
Well, I'm not optimistic, especially after studying the conflict over the past 20 years or 30 years. The Palestinians in their hearts, 99% of them today regard the state of Israel and Zionism as illegitimate. They see the state of Israel as a robber state which stole their land. That's how they see it. They don't care about or don't know about the connection of the Jews to the land of Israel from about 3,000 years ago down to the 1st century AD, and they don't care about diaspora Jewry's 2,000 years striving to somehow rebuild Jerusalem or return to Jerusalem. All of this doesn't interest them. They see Israel and Zionism as a robber ideology, and this is how they saw it from the beginning. And this essentially meant expulsionism. In other words, they didn't want the Jews to arrive in Palestine and don't want the Jews to actually remain, certainly not as sovereigns in any part of Palestine, Israel. In 1937, in the Peel Commission, which I mentioned earlier, the British effort to find a solution to the problem of the warring Jews and Arabs in Palestine in 1937, Haj Amin al-Husseini testified, and he said there that they asked him, well, if we turn Palestine into a Jewish state, this is what the Peel Commission said to him, if we allow it to do what you want and turn Palestine into an Arab state, what will be the fate of the Jews there? At the time, there were maybe 300,000 Jews in Palestine. And he said, well, those who were born before 1917, in other words, before the massive Jewish immigration to Palestine, he was talking about, say, 50,000 perhaps remained of the pre-1917 Jewish population, they will be allowed to stay in the country and become citizens of the Palestine Arab state. And what about the rest? Well, the future will take care of them, by which he meant they would not receive citizenship and presumably would be expelled. And this remained essentially an essential part of the PLO charter from the 1960s, which also stated Jews born in Palestine, and we're now talking about the 1960s, so there were probably almost no Jews still alive born before 1917, but the PLO charter said Jews from before 1917 are legitimate and can stay in the Palestine Arab state, which will arise on the ruins of the Jewish state we aim to destroy. This was the PLO charter from the 60s. But those, presumably those who arrived in Palestine or were born there after 1917, they would have no place there. So what I'm saying is, and the Hamas, of course, the Hamas charter from 1988 is equally explicit, even more so, and doesn't even talk about the 1917 Jews from before 1917. They basically don't want Jews to remain there. The charter has a line, the Hamas charter from 88, which says every rock, when a Jew is being hunted down by Muslims, every rock will come and say, behind me is a Jew, come and kill him. And that's essentially the Hamas's attitude to Jews in Israel.
Thank you. Jeffrey, I have one question for you, and then we'll go to what some of our listeners have written in. In a recent article in Sapir magazine, you wrote, the generation that created the state and its supporters abroad viewed it as part of the era of liberal and left opposition to colonialism, racism, and of course, anti-Semitism, as you've discussed in your talk. And so my question simply is, how do you explain then the left's turn against Israel today? Why is it so decisive? And corollary to this, whereas Israel is manifestly not the product of classical colonialism or even of so-called settler colonialism, why is actual Islamist colonial ambition of Iran in support of Hamas and its establishment of Hezbollah not criticized by the left?
That's a mouthful. So three responses. First, in the 1960s, the combination of the Soviet Union and then the Third World left and the Western New Left associated the Palestine Liberation Organization with global anti-imperialism, and Arafat and the other splinter groups of the PLO presented themselves as part of the same international, essentially communist movement associated with the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cuba, what have you. So a generation that came of age in the 60s and 70s around the world who regarded themselves as leftists began to view the PLO, as part of the family, part of that international revolutionary left-wing anti-imperialist family. That rested on ignorance about the kind of things that Benny and I just described, about the realities of 1948, and a lot of communist forgetfulness about what its policies were during the war. So that's one set. That set of ideas that emerged in the 60s and 70s and became a conventional wisdom within SDS, within the Black Panther Party, within West German radicalism, Trotskyists in Britain, what have you. That accounts for that kind of leftist empathy, sympathy for, quote, the Palestinians. But the third dimension is the most peculiar, because what has happened in the last 10, 15, 20 years is that people who regard themselves as leftists or liberals describe Hamas as part of this same struggle against imperialism. And as we pointed out in the first webinar, the origins of Hamas lie more properly in the ideology of the extreme right, not having nothing to do really with the extreme with the left. So that is one of the most peculiar aspects of what's going on around the world, in Europe and the United States too. It's one thing I can understand. I don't agree, but I can understand that if one would regard oneself as a Marxist-Leninist or a leftist of some sort, then the arguments for the PLO might make some bizarre sense. Again, ignoring the realities of 1947-48. But that people who regard themselves now as progressives or leftists would then refrain from criticism, or in effect not want Hamas to lose this war, that's somewhat of a novelty. And when we have people who regard themselves as leftists, in effect making excuses or apologies for what is fundamentally a reactionary organization. One can argue about whether that's new or unprecedented, but it's quite different from what was going on in the 60s and 70s.
Can I add something?
Please.
I think one can't belittle the importance of 50 years of Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Never mind that it was forced on Israel by Arab aggression and Arab provocation, but the 50 years of Israeli occupation, which is a military occupation with all that implies, and the last 15 years of Netanyahu government, in which Netanyahu is identified with the state of Israel, and Netanyahu is seen by many Israelis, perhaps by now most Israelis, as both incompetent and a crook, an inciter to violence, a man who's divisive inside Israel. All these two things, the occupation and the Netanyahu government, have overshadowed the experience of Israel from before 1967 and a view of the whole of the Zionist project. And when the bubble burst on the 7th of October, everybody related to Israel as an occupying power, never mind why it became an occupying power in 67, and in the image of Netanyahu, in which Israel is not in the image of Netanyahu, but that seems to be how Israel is seen in the world today.
Let me ask you a question, Benny. From the security point of view of the Israeli armed forces, the occupation of the West Bank is not the same thing as supporting West Bank settlers who want to live there. The argument for not leaving the West Bank from the military perspective is because Israel left Lebanon, it left Gaza, it did not get peace. If it left the West Bank, the whole country would be vulnerable. So that's one set of issue. And then the other is an occupation to protect settlers who want to occupy this for various religious reasons, whatever. I wonder if you could discuss that a bit, the difference.
I completely agree with you, what you imply. Israel cannot have a Hamas-led Palestinian state or entity in the West Bank, much as there was a Hamas entity or is a Hamas entity in the Gaza Strip, which periodically over the past 20 so years has been rocketing Israel. If such an entity came into being under Hamas control, and most Palestinians support the Hamas, not the PLO today, as all opinion polls show, if the Hamas ruled the West Bank, a West Bank state, it would be an enormous danger to Israel's very existence. This is certainly true, and Israeli military thinkers, generals, and so on, don't want to relinquish the West Bank, the heights of the West Bank, and certainly not the whole line along the Jordan River to Palestinian sovereignty. This is a problem. On the other hand, I think most Israeli generals would certainly like to get the settlers out of their hair and the problem of the settlement enterprise out of their hair. In other words, the army shouldn't be involved, shouldn't be focused on supporting a settler project, which is only made things worse. Israel's condition in the world and Israel's geopolitical condition in the Middle East worse. So I think you're right in separating the strategic thinking that no a Palestinian entity, certainly one led by the Hamas, should control the West Bank on the one hand, but on the other hand, one can't abandon the West Bank completely, and at the same time preserve somehow this settlement enterprise, which in my mind, of course, was a terrible mistake, a historic mistake on Israel's part, allowing that enterprise to go forward.
Thank you both. We're out of time, but we have numerous questions. So if you can hang on for a couple more minutes, I would like to ask some of these questions that people have sent in. The first would be to you, Benny. How do you appraise the equitability of the original partition, e.g., in terms of the amount of arable land apportioned to each population?
Well, if you're talking about the 1947 United Nations General Assembly partition resolution, it awarded the Jews 55% of Palestine's landmass and about 40-something% to the Palestinian Arabs. And the Palestinians later said, well, this was an unjust and inequitable distribution of the land because we are 2/3 of the population of Palestine, whereas the Jews are only 1/3. But the Jews then were able to answer, and I think quite logically, more than half of the land of that 55% allocated to the Jews, more than half was wilderness, was the Negev desert. In other words, the Jews got only a small proportion of Palestine's arable land. And the Jews had a second argument, which was that the United Nations created the Jewish state not just for the 650,000 Jews who already lived in Palestine, but for the hundreds of thousands who were expected to come from Europe, survivors of the Holocaust, and perhaps also from the Arab lands, who were going to settle in Palestine and therefore needed more land for the Jews there. These are the two major arguments that one can offer against what seemed like an inequitable distribution of 55% for the Jews and 40-something% for the Arabs.
Another question also to you, Benny. Is there any consensus with Palestinian scholars at all beyond raw dates? That is to say, with Israeli scholars on any aspect of this history that we're talking about?
Not really, but I think this is partly to do with the fact that Israeli historians of the conflict, at least in recent decades, have, I think, looked objectively and honestly at what happened in the conflict from 1882 until the present day, more or less. Whereas Arab historians haven't. They aren't able to, partly because Arab societies are all dictatorships. You can't write critically about the Arab leadership or the Arab policies or the Arab steps and policies in the course of the conflict. If you write critically about this, you might be actually killed if you're living in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip or East Jerusalem. And even if you were working in America, like Rashid Khalidi or something, you still have all your relatives, all your lands, your home, in fact, is in Palestine, in East Jerusalem. So if Rashid Khalidi was to write honestly about the conflict in terms of the actual facts and history, he would certainly be criticized by his own side, and he might even endanger his family or himself when he comes on a home visit. But one should add something to this, to be completely honest. We Israelis so far have won the conflict, and therefore we have a state, and we can be critical of it, and we live in a democracy. So the worst that can happen to you is you won't get grants or you won't get a job in the Hebrew University, but you're not going to be murdered. Whereas Arabs don't have a state, and providing ammunition by self-criticism to the Jewish side isn't really feasible because they don't have anything in hand yet. So it's easier for Jews and Israelis to write honestly about the conflict, and it's very difficult for Arabs to do so.
All of the questions seem to be for you, Benny.
It's fine with me.
This next is, you seem to intimate that Jews across the Middle East voluntarily emigrated to Israel. Others have referred to this as non-voluntary collective punishment for Israel's winning of their wars. Could you please explain?
It's complex. Israelis tended to say the Jews of the Arab lands were expelled by the governments and societies in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Syria, whatever. That's not really correct. What happened was that Zionism and the war in 48 led the Arab governments and societies amid which the Jews in Arab lands lived to feel or to fear that the Jews would become pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist, or might even be subversive and help the Zionists in the course of the war or afterwards. So they essentially turned against the Jews. There was also anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism in Islam. There's an anti-Semitic tradition in the Arab world. And this also came into play, the Jews as subversives. So basically what happened was there were some pogroms in 48 and 49 against Jews in Syria and Aleppo, in Bahrain, would you believe, where there were perhaps 5 Jews. In Morocco, there were pogroms in 48. But basically the societies amid which the Jews lived wanted to throw them out. They wanted to expel them, to cough them out. And that's what happened. And the governments pressured the Jews in Iraq and Egypt. There was terrorism against the Jews. Hundreds or thousands of Jews were incarcerated in internment camps in Iraq. So they were sort of pressured by the governments there to leave, and they left. There was also the pull, of course, of the Zionist movement and Israel wanting more Jewish immigrants to reach Israel. Israel was undermanned. It had only 650,000 Jews. So the Israeli government called them and pressured them to come, if you like, also to Israel. So there was a pull and a push in the departure of the Jews from Arab lands. There were 1 or 2 places where there was expulsions. From Egypt, for example, in 1956, Jews were actually expelled in the wake of the Sinai campaign.
I think, Jeffrey, this might be for you. How do you view the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in educating Israelis and Palestinians, especially in Gaza? Well, maybe both of you. I don't know if you can answer this.
I'm not sure what the question is.
How do you view the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in educating Israelis and Palestinians, especially in Gaza? What is your opinion of a book such as Palestine in Israeli school books, Ideology and Propaganda in Education by Nuret Peled Elhanan? Maybe Benny, you know something.
Yeah, I don't know about the particular book.
Well, I haven't read the book, but I know the lady. Look, in Arab textbooks in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, Jews are described negatively. Israel is described as an evil state, and Zionism is an evil ideology. And essentially, they call for the extirpation of Israel and perhaps even of the Jews. That's official textbooks in the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, it's a little more mixed because Israel controls part of the West Bank, but the image of Israel is not favorable in Arab textbooks in general. I assume in the Arab world in general as well. In Israel, the situation is more complicated. There's different types of textbooks. There's less government control of which textbooks are used in which types of schools. There's different types of schools, religious, ultra-religious, secular, and so on. I think that the image of Arabs in Israeli textbooks, certainly in the first decades of Israel's existence, were negative, the image of the Arabs. But I think this has changed. I think in most textbooks, the Arabs are not described negatively, certainly not as evil. But I'm not sure that in the religious stream schools and the ultra-Orthodox schools, Arabs are portrayed particularly favorably.
I would add this, that as the issue of the Palestinian voice has come up, one of the things that we're doing in this series is giving voice to, is listening to certain Palestinian voices. And when one looks at the PLO charter or the Hamas charter, or there is one historical subject, which is the Zionists, and then the Arabs and the Palestinians are objects; they are victims. And one reads those kind of documents as if the Palestinians had no agency. And it's important to remember that the various partition plans from 1937 on and 1947, and then the Oslo discussions, all of them created the possibility for a Palestinian state. And it is a terrible tragedy that the Palestinian leadership turned that down. This is very obvious, but it's too often forgotten that the partition plan did not just create a Jewish state, it created an Arab state as well. And because it was half a loaf and not the whole loaf, the Palestinian leadership unfortunately turned that down.
One last question. As Jeffrey Herf shows so well, the settler colonial take on Israel distorts the actual Arab rejection of the Jewish state, which was based instead on Islamist religious opposition. Given that the actual religious holy war mindset has persisted since 1948 and is still dominant now, what hope is there that this will change in the future? Maybe.
Well, that's why Israel needs to win this war, and to be able somehow to convince the world that that Hamas, not it, is responsible for this civilian suffering in Gaza. The defeat of Hamas is, we're historians, and so neither of us has a magic formula about how peace is going to emerge in the Middle East. But one thing that I think is a precondition for any hope for peace in the Middle East is the defeat of Hamas. Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan have suggested to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to General Gallant that there is some other way of defeating Hamas other than attacking its bases in Rafah. And if they can come up with some other way of doing it, more power to them. I haven't seen it so far. But I don't let us hope that there are other Palestinian voices who will come to the fore once Hamas is defeated. But it has been in power for 17 years. 17 years. It's controlled the schools and the media. And as Professor Morris has pointed out, it's popular. So certain pessimism and sobriety is certainly in order.
I would just add to that. I agree. I think my pessimism is deeper than Jeffrey's. I also support the defeat of the Hamas, and I think that would certainly be a precondition to peace, so long as the Hamas exists and certainly dominates the Palestinian psyche as it does today. The Palestinians are not going to make peace with Israel. But I fear that even if they are defeated, it's not going to change the situation. Basically, Palestinians will still want all of Palestine and won't want peace with Israel. This is my fear.
As an old Russian proverb says, we will live and we will see. Let us hope for a better future. Thank you both very, very much. And thank you all for listening.